10 years ago, Captain America the First Avenger was released in theaters, starring Chris Evans, Haley Atwell, Hugo Weaving, Sebastian Stan, Tommy Lee Jones, and a huge amount of other people. I've done a video on this once before, a few years back when it was leading up to Captain America Civil War. At that point on my YouTube channel, I didn't really put a whole lot of effort into my stuff back then, or at least I don't think I did. So I feel like I probably should have more to say. I can't really go back and watch that because it makes me cringe like really hard. But I've also had some time to process this movie in light of all the other films that have come after it, especially in light of Avengers Endgame. Will this be like a traditional review of sorts? I'm not really sure. I think it'll go more off of like how I felt about the movie over time. How do I think it feels in light of all the movies that have come out since then? Stick around and hear me ramble on a little bit if you'd like. Think of this as like the First Avenger 10 years later. When people think of the Captain America movies, we often tend to point out Winter Soldier and Civil War, which is my personal favorite of the three, but also my favorite solo MCU movie. And as good as those two movies are, the first one doesn't get nearly as much credit. And it's not a perfect movie. I have a few problems with it, but I think in some ways it's very underrated and underappreciated. And there's certain moments that happen throughout that make it the overall experience of the MCU a lot more richer, especially with its connections to Thor, since Johann Schmidt takes the Tesseract from the town of Tonsberg, which is where Thor ends up staying at in Avengers Endgame, using the Tesseract to power the weapons he and Hydra are constructing for the war effort against the Allied forces. This is basically the origin story for Captain America. The first 45 to 50-ish minutes I think are pretty solid. In fact, I think there are some of the best parts of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Chris Evans, I think, is a solid casting choice for this character. He comes off as very endearing, sincere, and a very overall just good-hearted person. When they announced him to play Steve Rogers, a lot of people were not really jazzed about that because he was famous for like teen comedies or Not Another Teen Movie. I had seen him in the movie Cellular, and then I saw him as Johnny Storm in the 2005 Fantastic Four. That movie wasn't necessarily great or anything, but it was fun, and he was really likable as Johnny Storm. But when I saw that he was announced to play Captain America, I thought, I don't know about that. That seems a little off, because the character of Captain America, as you know, is the complete opposite of Johnny Storm, the Human Torch. One's a know-it-all hothead and one's a very humble and heroic hero. Seeing Chris Evans play him, they couldn't have chosen a better person. The complete opposite of Tony Stark in so many ways. But just seeing how sincere Steve Rogers wants to just go off and fight for his country, you don't really see that too often these days. And I think that attitude was very much in vein with the time period that this is set in, because after America was attacked at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, a lot of men and women felt this really strong desire to go serve their country and get back at the people that attacked them. And I've heard other World War II veterans say this in interviews, that you felt like something wasn't right with you inside if you didn't go off and fight for your country back then. There was a sense of patriotism that the country felt, especially after spending a decade trying to recover from the Great Depression. And I also know, because my grandparents grew up in that era in the 30s and 40s, both sets of my grandparents, and they've told me all kinds of stories about how they felt like they wanted to get back at the Nazis and the Japanese for the way they were taking over certain areas of the world. And Steve Rogers isn't that kind of guy who signs up and says, I want to kill Nazis, I want to go out there and kill me some Germans or something. There's two moments in this movie of what his intentions are in his heart, such as a moment like this.
Bucky, come on, there are men laying down their lives. I got no right to do any less than them. That's what you don't understand.
And if not the best line, it's one of the best lines in the movie, is when he meets Dr. Abraham Erskine, played by Stanley Tucci, who's intrigued by Steve Rogers after overhearing him talk with Bucky. He notices that he had 5 previous attempts.
I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from.
First time I saw this, when he said that, instantly Captain America became my favorite Avenger. And he's been my favorite ever since. If you couldn't tell already by the shirts I wear in these videos, I think that should say it all. My apologies to Team Iron Man. I lean more towards the pure-hearted good guys. Sue me. And even though there's not a whole lot of scenes with Stanley Tucci, he's just about likable in anything that he's in. I remember first seeing him in the Beethoven movie from 1992, and then other things like Shall We Dance, Made in Manhattan, probably not some of the greatest, but he always gives it his best efforts in anything I've seen him in. And his German accent sounds good to me. And he is a little bit of the comic relief in this movie, but he's a lot more serious than the other roles that I've seen him do. And I love the conversation that he has with Steve in the barracks. Johann Schmidt felt very convinced that there was power of the gods left on the earth by Odin or whoever, but for Schmidt it is not fantasy, it is reality. And it gives a little bit of backstory to the Red Skull's origin. We'll talk about the Red Skull in a little while, but also in that scene,
that you will stay who you are.
Not a perfect soldier,
are good men.
And it's a lot more impactful when Erskine is killed by that one Hydra agent in Brooklyn, where as he's dying and Steve Rogers is looking over his body, he points to his heart. Remember what I told you. No matter what happens, you stay a good person. And it's a promise that Cap kept all the way up to his dying day. Another reason why I love Captain America. And with Steve in basic training, it's another example of how much of an underdog he feels. Even though he's a scrappy kid from Brooklyn, his heart and his determination is what really sticks out to Erskine and Agent Carter, played by Haley Atwell, serving under Colonel Phillips, played by Tommy Lee Jones, who is just doing the Tommy Lee Jones thing as usual. Yet again, he can always get away with it. And Colonel Phillips isn't convinced that this guy is the one that they're looking for, especially as Steve struggles to try to get through these different obstacles in these different training sessions by crawling in the mud under a barbed wire, climbing over a roped bridge or whatever. And oddly enough, that takes me right back to basic training, even though this takes place many, many years or decades before I enlisted. In fact, the scene when the doctor is overlooking him, I actually had to go through something like that when I was going through a military enlistment processing station, or MEPS as it's called. This movie came out a year before I enlisted, so just keep that in mind. But as I was going through the processing part of getting enlisted, I actually thought of that scene where Steve tries to lie his way into the military. What'd your father die of? Mustard gas. He was in the 107th Infantry. My mother got killed. Couldn't shake it. I thought about saying something like that, but I thought, no, I better not. But the training scene is also another example of Steve Rogers' heart. Colonel Phillips points out to that one guy, Hodge, who's the bully of this group, that he's someone who respects authority, obeys orders, and that he's a soldier, but Erskine says, no. That guy's a bully. But in order to prove his point, Colonel Phillips throws that dummy grenade saying, you win wars with guts, Doctor, not kindness.
Get away! Get back!
That is what I call guts. And even though it might come off as a bit annoying for some people that Steve Rogers being just this pure-hearted good guy, some might not find that realistic, but there are people like that who do exist in this world. And I strongly strive every day to be that kind of person. In fact, Chris Evans actually said in an interview one time that he's everything that I wish I could be as a man. You and me both, Chris. You and me both. I'm trying as hard as I can. It might come off as unrealistic and too old-fashioned, but, you know, the way Joe Johnston portrays this character, and also with the help of the writers, there's no single hint of irony portrayed with this character. It's not like it's embarrassed to admit that Captain America just comes from this really, oh, gee whiz, oh, shucks kind of era. It embraces the campiness of this character, especially when they show his old-fashioned costume when he goes on that Bond tour after getting injected with the formula.
Not all of us can storm a beach or drive a tank, but there's still a way all of us can fight.
Series E defense bonds. Each one you buy is a bullet in the barrel of your best guy's gun. The whole vibe that this movie has. It's a perfect recapturing of the 1940s era. And I showed this to my grandparents some years ago who grew up in the 1930s and 40s. I could tell just from the look on their faces with how people dressed, how people talked, and the music that they heard in this movie took them right back to that time period. I think if a movie does that to you, it's doing something right. It definitely feels very modern. This did come out about 10 years ago, so it wasn't that long ago, but it's not modern in the way where it makes you feel disconnected. You actually feel like you're right in that place in the 1940s. It's basically a period piece. Joe Johnston is known for doing that in The Rocketeer, which I have to admit, I have yet to watch. It's on my list, don't you worry. But the kind of flair and energy that he brings, it doesn't come off as cliched or obnoxious, because the 1940s, we tend to think, at least I tend to think of people who talk really fast in those black and white movies, like Jimmy Stewart or Humphrey Bogart. People actually talk like normally. They don't talk like you see in those 1930s and 40s films. Hey, you listen to Jack Benny or Benny Goodman today? Hey, on today's radio in New York City, we got an old Manhattan. Benny Goodman is coming here to join us. I don't know what that was all about, but that was my poor attempt at a 1940s impression. Throughout the course of the movie, he manages to win the approval of Peggy Carter, who's the British agent on liaison to the US military leading the Super Soldier Division. But I also really like the relationship between Steve and Peggy. It feels very subtle. It's not so obvious that they're going to be a couple, even though it is pretty obvious. She is very capable and can take care of herself, especially when she kicks Hodge in the stomach and decks him in formation since he made it pass at her. She doesn't need a guy to rescue her every 5 seconds, even though that does happen once in this movie when she nearly gets run over by that Hydra agent and Steve saves her. And it shows just how innocent Steve really is. He hasn't had much experience with women. Even after he gets injected with the super soldier formula, when Howard Stark offers to take her out to a late night fondue, he assumes that they're gonna have dinner together. But Howard means something else, and Steve doesn't really understand. And as Peggy says, you still don't have a clue about women, do you? In a lot of ways, I actually relate to Steve in that regard. because I haven't had the greatest luck with women throughout my life. And we get a little bit of Howard Stark in here too, played by Dominic Cooper, who doesn't really look that much like the guy that we later see him portrayed by in Endgame and Iron Man 2, but this is like 30 years prior, so hey, you gotta accept it for what it is. And in a lot of ways, he definitely is Tony Stark's dad, although, albeit much more reasonable and not so annoying. And it's ironic to see him partnering and getting along well with Steve Rogers, considering how he and Tony would butt heads later on. Although I do wish we had more of Howard Stark and more of the scenes with Steve and his platoon with Bucky. But then when Steve goes on to his Bond tour throughout America and then later in Europe, he gets word that the 107th Infantry, which Bucky was a part of, is taken prisoner by Hydra. He goes rogue in order to find the prisoners of war and hopefully find his friend Bucky, which he ends up doing after he was experimented on by Dr. Zola. So he, along with hundreds of soldiers, managed to get away, and they form his platoon that serves under him, led by Steve and Bucky. And this is where the movie starts to lose some momentum, because this latter half of the movie, from when they rescue the soldiers up until Steve sacrifices himself in that plane, they montage through so much time. At least like a couple years go by. They show him on these various missions with his platoon, which is really cool stuff to see. We get a lot of great images, like when Cap busts through the door with the shield in front of him, then he pulls one guy out of this big Hydra tank, catches a bomb, throws it in, jumps off as the tank explodes, creating that perfect splash image that you would see in a comic book. And Alan Silvestri's music is blaring throughout this whole sequence, which, by the way, is one of the most underrated superhero scores ever produced. That main theme especially feels very patriotic and very militaristic. Almost sounds like it's going, Captain America. And it also has some of the most emotional moments in the film when he makes his self-sacrificing action by crashing the plane into the Arctic, even though they promised each other that they would go on a dance together. Now, knowing where Captain America ends up in Endgame, they actually end up doing that dance anyway. So it's not as sad upon retrospect, but still seeing his willingness to sacrifice himself even though he doesn't really want to. And Peggy, who feels a strong love for Steve, is really crushed by that. And I think the acting in this scene is just very raw, but some of the best acting that we've ever seen from a set of actors in the MCU. And it always gets me whenever I see Tommy Lee Jones have that sad look on his face where he actually finally realizes that he does like Steve Rogers after all. And I think it also in a way makes him wish that he was nicer to him before he made that move. And since we mentioned Endgame, there's other stuff throughout the movie that makes the experience more richer, like the initial goodbye that Steve and Bucky say to each other when Bucky goes off to war.
Don't do anything stupid until I get back.
How can I? Taking all the stupid with you.
The exact same exchange in Endgame before Cap goes to return the stones, except it's reversed. And I really like the development of the friendship between Bucky and Steve. They both grew up together in Brooklyn. They care for each other very deeply. There's a really good sense of brotherhood between the two, especially when they go off to war to fight together. Knowing Bucky's eventual fate throughout the rest of the movies, it's really interesting to see his place at this point in the timeline. And right where they go to the World's Fair and seeing Howard Stark showcase that floating car, that's when I realized, wait a minute. He kills him so many decades later as the Winter Soldier. All these connections, man. At least for me, when I think about that, it really, really messes with my head. And the interplay that he has with Steve feels very natural too. It definitely feels like they're best buddies. This isn't payback for it, is it? Now, why would I do that? And that mission is one of the other missions that I wish we saw more of in the second half, because they breeze right through so many of that stuff that I kind of hope that maybe one day we could actually get more insight as to what went on during those years that they were fighting together during the war, and that ragtag team that they get together, especially the Dum Dum Dugan character played by Neil McDonough, who was the voice of the Hulk in the 90s Hulk cartoon. But probably the most notable one for me is Buck Compton in Band of Brothers. I know they got some attention in the Peggy Carter TV show, which I didn't really see past the first episode. Who knows? Maybe they'll find an excuse later down the line. I doubt it, but you never know with Marvel. And Bucky falling from that train, like with Steve's supposed sacrifice, isn't quite as strong emotionally, but still, knowing that he eventually became a robot for Hydra and seeing Steve's response, even now, it still hits me. Then that leads us into the villain side of everything. Johann Schmidt, or the Red Skull, is basically the big bad guy who wants to take over the world, and there's really not much to him there. But they do give him a little bit of backstory, that he used to work with Dr. Abraham Erskine, that for him, he's actually convinced that there is power on the earth left by the gods, such as Odin and Thor, which he manages to obtain with the Tesseract by finding in that village Tonsberg, and uses it to power Hydra's weapons. And they break off from the Nazi regime in order to do their own thing by wiping out anybody that they see as a potential threat, which is very very much in vein with what Hydra tried to do in Winter Soldier by using that algorithm that Zola created. And Arnim Zola is in this movie too as his scientific advisor, played by Toby Jones, who you might know as Dobby from the Harry Potter films. And I think the only reason the Red Skull is very memorable is because it's Hugo Weaving. We've seen him in various films like The Matrix or The Lord of the Rings, and he brings a lot of charm and wit to this character. A lot of that is due to how good of an actor Hugo Weaving is, but if it hadn't been anybody else, I don't think really anybody would remember the Red Skull as much. And he's someone who took part in that super soldier serum program that Dr. Erskine was working on for Adolf Hitler, but against Erskine's warning, used the formula on himself, which had some not so great side effects, leading him to become the Red Skull. And the skull effects are superb. I don't know if that was makeup, I'm willing to bet that it could be, but even so, it looks good. You are failing! Unlike you, Captain, I embrace it proudly, without fear. Then how come you're running? There's a lot of other great moments in this movie too, like when Cap finds the vibranium shield that ends up becoming the shield that he uses, which we all know that vibranium comes from the country of Wakanda. Peggy firing 3 shots at the shield, much to the shock of everybody in the room. Or where Cap goes after that one Hydra agent in Brooklyn, accidentally crashing into that bridal shop. Always reminds me of this moment in the movie Cellular, also with Chris Evans.
I'm sorry!
Oh, are you? Suck it!
And we also get another great cameo from the one and only.
I thought he'd be taller.
So Steve crashes into the Arctic, supposedly dead. The war's over, everybody celebrates, but Peggy's still sad about Steve dying. And then it cuts to Steve lying in a hospital room. But listening to a radio broadcast on a radio on a nearby table, he realizes that he was actually at that game before he enlisted. Only then to discover that he's in the middle of a SHIELD headquarters in New York City, and that he's been asleep for 70 years.
You gonna be okay? Yeah, I just... I had a date.
Like with the other moments, not quite as sad, but still, right through the heart. I still remember my response to that moment. My mom and I looked at each other in complete disbelief when he starts running outside into the street and you realize that he's in our modern day. And I showed it to my dad when it later came out on DVD that year. He was shocked too. He kept looking at me like this. And as much as I don't like the fact that they montage through the last half of this movie, it almost feels like it had to be there because we had to get Captain America into the first Avengers movie, which I guess you gotta give it a little bit of leeway there. And if they made it like 2 Captain America movies where he goes off to war and then he continues to fight in the war and then ends up crashing, and then you made those 2 after that, I honestly wouldn't have cared. I think that's how it should have gone down, but they had the contract, they had to follow 3 solo films and 3 Avengers films, or as it later turned out to be 4. It doesn't bother me nearly as much, but still, I wish they could have added on maybe at the very least like 30 or 40 more minutes of stuff, where you actually see more of the missions that they go on throughout Europe. But all in all, the first Avenger, I think in a lot of ways is very underrated and should get more credit than it gets, especially in comparison to the following 2 sequels that came after. The montaging action scenes are as fun as they are to watch. They do drive me crazy because I wish that we had more time with Captain America and his squad. And I think the Red Skull in a lot of ways was kind of wasted and that there was so much more they could have done with him, especially considering that it was Hugo Weaving as that character. The first Avenger is still a really fun movie, and I got no problem saying that I think it's very underrated. And I think more people should go back and give it another try, especially in light of what we've seen in Avengers Endgame. So therefore, those are my thoughts on Captain America the First Avenger 10 years later. It's really hard to believe that it's been that long. But I think in a lot of ways, this movie has definitely aged a lot better in retrospect, especially with how certain things played out in the later movies. So if you haven't watched it in a while, give it another try. You might be surprised. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
What made to you so special?
Nothing. I'm just a kid from Brooklyn.
I can do this all day.
Not just New York tough, but Brooklyn tough.